Once upon a time, there was a Roman emperor named Dionysius II who was a tyrannical king of the Sicilian city of Syracuse, about 400 years before Christ. He was rich and powerful, but very unhappy. He was anxious, and he could not get over this. He was so anxious that he slept in a bedroom, apparently with a moat all the way around it, right? One of those moats, where the water's all the way around. And he would only let his trusted daughter shave his face or his beard for fear of being killed at any moment. This guy named Damocles came by one day, and they were laughing and joking, and Damocles remarked about how amazing it must be to live like a king. So the king, Dionysus, gave Damocles the chance of a lifetime. You, Damocles, get to live like a king right now. Since this life delights you, he said, do you wish to taste it yourself and make a trial of my good fortune? So Damocles agreed, of course. Who wouldn't agree? Dionysus seated him on a golden couch and ordered that a host of succulent cuts of meat and lavish things be given to him. Damocles could not believe his luck, but just as he was starting to enjoy this life of a king, he noticed that Dionysus had hung, see it right here, if you're not watching, he had hung a razor-sharp sword from the ceiling. It was positioned right over his head, suspended only by a single strand of horse hair, a thread, if you will. From then on, his fear, Damocles' fear for his very life, made it impossible to savor anything in the feast, or the opulence, or the incredible wealth that the king was bestowing during those times. So, after he looked up and just kept staring at the sword hanging terrifyingly right above his head, he excused himself and said, I think I will leave the fortunate kingly life to you. Now, this may or may not be a true story. Cicero, the poet-philosopher, included this story, and it's been through other philosophers as well. But this tale of Dionysus and Damocles represents this idea that those in power always labor under, quote, the specter of anxiety and death, and that there can be no happiness for one who is under constant apprehensions. This was a constant motif, and you may have heard the Sword of Damocles is hanging over your head. Or perhaps you've heard something a little bit more colloquial, like, this is just hanging on by a thread, or you're hanging on by a thread. All of that comes from this story, whether you knew it or not. This crazy, precarious situation. The reason I tell this story today is that we're going to look at the current culture and the current situation. And then there's a new study from Arizona Christian University Cultural Research Center, that was a big mouthful, that shows this culture, especially the youngest members, our millennial generation, is the most anxious and the most worried of any generation we have, at least on record. We need to talk about that because that informs how we live our lives and how we help and love those around us. Because here at Church Public, one of the goals that we have is not just following Jesus yourself, which is a very important thing, and I think is ultimately the thing you need to get back to. But how do you live in this world? How do you help this world? How do you love this world? How do you love the people of this world? How are we going to do living in culture and not becoming like it? These are very important questions, and we'll tackle a couple of them today. So, welcome to Church Public. I'm Matt Odegaard. Let's get started. Again, welcome back to Church Public. Thank you for joining me here today. I certainly appreciate it. We have a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the news, but I wanted to hit this story because I think this is one of the bigger ones that addresses the current culture, especially this new generation. And if you didn't know, the millennial generation is the largest generation ever recorded in the history of humanity. And that's important. It's important to note that. It's important to note that not only does this generation encompass more than most or any other generation before it, they are now becoming or already the leaders in school and culture and university and corporation. They do live in all of these places and work in all of these places and lead in many of these places. And we need to understand what is going on. What is going on with this generation? And we need to understand that because we, as followers of Jesus, need to, as Jesus has told us, make disciples and pour into those that are coming after us. This is a very important goal that we need to have for our world and for the next generation, which now really is the current generation. So what do we do with that? Well, this study is interesting, and this study we just have to look at. We have to look at this study because it shows some things, if the study is to be believed, about what is going on in this generation. And we need to recognize that, and we need to understand that. So I will try my best not to be boring with numbers and statistics and things. I want to talk more in generalities and more about what this means for us. But I will reference some numbers. Again, this is the study from Arizona Christian University Cultural Research Center. One of the biggest things that comes out of this new study is that 75% of millennials surveyed are desperately seeking the meaning and purpose in life. This has led them to questioning purpose and their very reason for living. This is the really important thing, and this is the thing that we have to understand, that meaning is ultimately almost the source of life. And I don't mean that literally, because obviously God is the source of life, and you could talk more philosophically or existentially, but in that more philosophical sense, you need to have meaning. You need to know why you are here to actually function. And we're discovering that on a large scale with this latest generation that is struggling to find that. Again, these are going to be very generalized terms, and not everyone in this generation is dealing with these things, but many, many are, as referenced by this study. And it's important to point to this as we look at generalities, because we need to understand what issues this current culture is dealing with. And then what do we do about that? So this study was led by George Barna. You may have heard of Barna Research. The Barna study through ACU is titled Millennials in America, New Insights into the Generation of Growing Influence. And that's important. It's important to recognize all of these things. It's important to recognize that millennials are the biggest generation in history, that they also are the new leaders of the modern world. We'll just stick with, especially in America, but their influence is growing and should grow and has to grow in order to take over the reins of literally the world. This generation is the future now of the world, and especially in America, and they have to lean into that. But when you look at things like this study, it can be a little depressing in the sense that if 75% of them are struggling to figure out why they are here and what is their reason for being, then you're going to have a lot of trouble leading into, well, where do you go? Because you can't lead, you can't drive forward if you don't know where you are or where you've been or why you are here. It's really important to note. And I don't think it's coincidental, things that we'll look at in a moment, like this generation also is the least religious, or at least the least modern Christian or contemporary Christian or traditional Christian in terms of values and morals. They don't want to go to church. They don't like going to church. They don't maybe even believe in the church, while at the same time, many do identify as Christian or do say that Jesus is a good person or a good way, or maybe even some measure of God. But at the same time, even in the same sentence, they'll say things like, but Buddha is also God, and Muhammad is also God, etc., and on and on. And this leads to problems because, as many of you may know, if you have read through the Bible or followed Jesus for any length of time, some of those statements are not actually equal. Jesus is not equal to Buddha or Muhammad. I've talked about that at other times. You can check those out at churchpublic.com. So I won't get into too much apologetics today as for why Jesus is the only way. I guess at the least, I will point you to John 14:6, where Jesus says as much. But it's important to note this, and I'll read a little bit from kind of the summary of the study. The study is very long. I don't have it right in front of me. I think it was like 80 pages. It's a very long study, so I'm not going to read, obviously, all of the statistics. But it's very long, it's very comprehensive, and therefore it bears looking at and holds merit, and we need to examine it. So in this study, I'll read some of this research for you. Quote, the research found that fewer than 1 in 5 contend, around 22%, that life is sacred, while half argues that life is what you make it. There is no absolute value associated with human life, end quote. That's such a scary statement to me. Half of those surveyed in the millennial generation don't believe that human life itself has value. And this is where part of the problem lies. If you don't know that your worth comes from God, that God created you, not only unintentionally as just some random creature, but intentionally and even specifically with a purpose. Read Jeremiah 29:11, read Ephesians 2, where Paul says, you were created ahead of time with works that were created for you to do. You not only are created intentionally, but you have a specific role. You have a specific role to play right here and right now. Read Esther, read Ruth. I won't go into all of those different places, but just as a theme, as an arc of who God is and who you are in relationship to God, you absolutely do have a purpose and you have a meaning and you were prepared ahead of time. But it is shocking and really saddening to me that 50% of this generation doesn't believe that's true. They don't believe that there is value in human life, period. Now, of course, as we've talked about in other places, this extends to abortion and it extends to even end-of-life care. And so where we literally have a culture of death, again, I've done many episodes on that at churchpublic.com. You can check those out. But just to note that it makes total sense in correlation when you have this generation that just doesn't value human life, that they're fighting so much for, unfortunately, there's no better or easier way to put it, human death, because it doesn't matter. And that's very sad. I'll read a little bit more from this. Quote, most millennials are only moderately satisfied with their lives, including areas of personal health, spiritual life, career, relationships, finances, and the nation, according to this research. In fact, the overwhelming majority of millennials longs for improvement. Listen to this. Only 5% think life is great and there is no need for changes, end quote. 5%, that's it. Only 5% are happy with the way they are. Now, I know this is even more than millennials. I know that most people I run into are just chronically overwhelmed by their life, and they don't like their life, and they don't like where their life is. And we're going to read a couple of verses about that, and we're going to try to gain a little bit of perspective in a moment, but I want to get through a little bit more of this first. It's just important for you to hear that only 5% of those millennials surveyed believe that their life is going well. 5%. That's a terrible, and that should shock you, and it should make you sad in your heart, because this generation just has no direction. And again, I'm speaking generally. And if you're in this generation, I want you to hear this so that you know, one, you're not alone. Even if you're not in this generation and you're feeling this way, you're not alone. And it's good to not be alone. And two, you're not at the end. There is hope. You haven't reached a place where you cannot move forward. In fact, the exact opposite is true. And just to call it out straight, these are lies from the devil, or at least from this broken world, that you don't have value and you don't have meaning. And the reality is, in God's kingdom, the opposite is true. You, as a human, regardless of whether you believe in God or not, you as a human have inherent and eternal value, more value than anything imaginable. And it saddens me that 95% of these millennials, and maybe more in other generations, don't know that or feel that or understand God and his love for them. I'll read some more. Quote, what we're witnessing is a generation in crisis. What we're witnessing is a generation in crisis in all areas of life. This was said by the president of ACU, Arizona Christian University, Len Munsell. To see this generation so lacking in meaning and purpose to see this generation so lacking in meaning and purpose at such a young age is heartbreaking. They are rejecting the ways of God and are desperately seeking something, anything, to take his place. Sadly, the truth is that without God, people will inevitably conclude that life is meaningless. And he's exactly right in that. This president of the university has summarized the gospel precisely. Without God, it is meaningless. Again, read through Ecclesiastes if you want to be both depressed and then hopefully by the end a little bit encouraged. Solomon, this is nothing new. This is why Solomon keeps saying there's nothing new under the sun. What you're feeling today is not new. It's not even different. And I don't mean that to condescend. I just mean that to say these are not new human problems. The problem with it is the scale. The problem is there are so many feeling this way, and I don't know if they all feel like they're alone. I don't know if you feel like you're the only one dealing with this. So again, you're not the only one. But beyond that, this is not a new problem. It is that if you only grab onto who you are or what your identity is in yourself or your race or your gender or what people have told you it is, unfortunately, that only leads to more feelings of meaningless and frustration and lack of purpose. You cannot find what you're looking for within yourself. It just isn't possible. And this world is not telling you that. This world is telling you the opposite. This world is saying, go on social media and become an influencer, and then you will have meaning. Make $1 billion, and then you will have meaning. Have 1,000 million friends, and then you will have meaning. Find all the hookups that you can, and then you will have meaning. All of these different things that the world is saying will give you what you're looking for, and the reality is, unfortunately, they're all lies. They're not true. There is nothing in this world that can give you meaning. Again, if you want to be both depressed and hopefully by the end encouraged, read Ecclesiastes, where Solomon deals with literally all of these problems. And if you think that you have either more than anyone else in history or more problems than anyone else in history, read through Solomon and read about what he went through and all that he had and all that he lost and all that he gained and all that he found through his searching. If you're looking for that, and again, and you're looking in paper Bible, it's about a little bit less than the middle, a little bit before the middle. If you're looking in your Bible, I highly recommend Ecclesiastes. It's again a little bit of a depressing read, but also hopefully really encouraging read. Stick with it. I encourage you to stick with it. So according to this study, again, this generation has just an incredible crisis of meaning and crisis of value. And we should feel that as believers. We should feel that as people who are following after God, because we don't want people to misunderstand who they are. And these are great things to pray for. If you have someone in your life that's dealing with this, if you yourself are dealing with this, these are great things to pray for and pray through. So I mentioned that Barna was one that oversaw this study. So he, the author of the study, agreed that many of the challenges flow from rejection of God and rejection of absolute truth, along with their false worldview. He actually, in this study, and I'll try to post a link to it in the description, you can download the whole study for free if you want. One of the particular sections that I found interesting was that Barna really equates a lot of this to worldview. And worldview, in a nutshell, is the way you see the world. Do you see the world in a biblical way, according to God's kingdom, the way that God has arranged things, or do you see the world in a different way? Do you see the world in a way of where you are the center of it, or someone else is the center of it, or the government is the center of it, or and what ideology, what lens do you see the world through? Is everyone just generally good and they're making mistakes? Is everyone generally bad and they need to get better? How do you view the world? And this generation views the world in a certain way, by and large, again, very generally speaking. And this leads to a lot of this lack of value and lack of meaning. For instance, Barna says, quote, "Millennials have largely bought into the worldview that teaches Life is about me. He goes on. They contend that life is most likely to have meaning when we experience maximum happiness, thought to be the result of personal accomplishment or comfort. End quote. Again, this is what I've been saying, and I see this. This is a lot of means why I started this. I want people to understand the way that you see the world largely impacts the way that you interact with the world. If you believe that your goal in life is to just be happy or have friends or have lovers or have money or something, that's only going to get you so far. Jim Carrey famously said a quote many years ago. I'm going to paraphrase it, but essentially he said, I hope that everyone gets rich and famous to realize that it doesn't actually accomplish anything. And you can go look up that quote. I didn't prepare that, but that's essentially what he said. And he's absolutely right. As one who has been rich and famous. Again, I'll refer you back to Solomon as someone who was more rich and more famous, but some of you don't like looking at the Bible for reference. So I give you a modern celebrity instead. Essentially, they actually say the same thing, because true things are true things, regardless of what you want to be true, what you think is true, what you'd rather be true. Unfortunately, true things are just true things. So I'm going to read a little more from Barna. He said, quote, the confusion is multiplied by believing that we're basically good people and that our purpose will emerge through dialogue or voluntary acts of goodwill. Unfortunately, he said, that combination only leads to emptiness, end quote. And again, I agree with this. If we're just pursuing our goals, this is what I've said many times, you be you, or you do you, or find your truth, or live your truth, or your truth is your truth, or all of these things. They don't actually work. They may be catchy phrases, but they're just not real, and they're actually just not true. And what we're seeing now in study of people at large is it only leads to more desperation, and it only leads to more sadness. It doesn't make you happy. And I probably say this a lot, but this is the important thing. You can't be happy by pursuing your full desires. Not that your desires are bad in themselves, but they are not what is going to ultimately make you happy. And what I want to tie into here, I think this is important. I'm going to tie into this, that one of the most important findings, and I don't think I can undersell this, is that millennials have one of the lowest levels of biblical understanding or biblical worldview. Since Barna, like a few decades ago, started doing these, only a third of millennials claim to believe in God at all, and 24 out of 25, 96% of them lack biblical worldview. Did you hear that? Do you understand that? Do you comprehend like how big that is? If 96% of this generation just hasn't read the Bible, or doesn't understand the Bible, or doesn't know what parts of the Bible, or they're getting their Bible, I harp on this a lot, but getting their Bible from influencers on social media, they are not going to understand this world. Maybe you are in that category. Maybe you're in the category where you just believe some things about the Bible, but have never actually opened the Bible. And that's why I have it here sitting next to me. If you're just listening and you're not watching a video, I'm pointing to it. I'm touching it. This is a physical Bible. Yeah, I don't care if you read a physical Bible. You can open up. I'll grab my phone. You can grab your phone. We're going to talk about some of the Bible apps in a second. I don't care how you get the Bible, but I think you and everyone you come in contact with, you should encourage them to actually read the Bible. It's just so important. It's because if you don't understand this, if you don't understand who you are, if you're even struggling for meaning, if you don't understand why you are here, I would encourage you to read some things. And again, I referenced Ecclesiastes earlier. That may be a good place for you to start. It may not, because it is, again, if you're not prepared for it, it's a bit of a depressing book. It does get better, but it is a depressing book. But read something like the Gospel of John. That may be a better place for you to start. Or even Romans. Romans is a little bit thicker in terms of understanding, but it's really good for understanding who you are. Because Paul goes into great deal to the Romans, who at the time, again, were not Jewish. So they didn't know Hebrew school. Most of us didn't go to Hebrew school. It's funny, the other day, as an aside, when I talk, I always ask who went to Hebrew school. And I had a guy raise his hand and say, I went to Hebrew school. And I was impressed, and I love it. Because most people don't know their biblical history and don't know. He's the 1% out of this generation. But at any rate, it's important to know. And why is it important to know? It probably just sounds like I'm proselytizing, and maybe you could take it that way, but I want you to understand who you are, and I think you can only understand who you are based on who God is. Because as we see through these studies, if you try to figure out who you are based on only your reference to the world, I believe 100% of the time you will fail. And don't take this the wrong way, you're just not that smart. There are, not me, there are hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of smarter people who have gone before, and just listen to this part. You could probably learn something from them. If you go into life, and again, I don't have these books behind me just to have books behind me. I try to read a lot because I know I'm not that smart. Going back to Socrates, if you don't believe the Bible, if you don't believe in me, Socrates was considered the wisest man alive. In fact, he was killed because people didn't like that he would reference that he was the wisest man alive. That's a longer story, but the point of it is this. He was referenced as the wisest man alive, and he was trying to figure out why he was the wisest man alive, or how he could be. And so he goes around asking all these really smart people, the business people, the philosophers, all the people around his town, like, tell me why you're smarter, giving them a chance to be smarter. And ultimately, the only thing he could figure out is he knew he was not very smart, and there was miles more that he could go. And everyone else thought they were the smartest person. Do you see that distinction? It's maybe subtle, but it's very specific. If you know that you're not that good, if you know that you still have room to grow, you actually are ahead of most of the curve. And that's a really important thing. And it speaks to, in biblical terms, going back to biblical terms, humility. That's this idea that you're not the center of the universe. And that's actually a good thing. Because do you really want to be the center of the universe? Again, going back to Jim Carrey in a funny movie, just when he gets to play God for a day, it just doesn't go well. That's a funny movie, but that's for another time. So back to this millennial issue. Barna makes clear in this analysis that the generation's lack of meaning, lack of purpose is a big deal. And it makes them stuck. That's the language that he uses, and I would agree. And I'll connect to this as well. One of the things that we've seen, especially through this shutdown and lockdown and all of this pandemic stuff, but reporting from the CDC, the suicide rates in 2020 jumped at least 5% in 25 to 34-year-olds. And that is a huge jump, especially in connection with other age groups that in most went down. In fact, unfortunately, suicide is the second leading cause of death among millennials. This should stab you in the heart. That's what it does to me. This is a huge tragedy that so many people are so hurting that they believe the best way out is to end their life, rather than understanding who they are. And again, back to that issue, if you have no inherent value in life, if you don't believe that humans have value in just being alive, then why would you stay alive? Just get rid of yourself and make the planet better. That's the thought, and that breaks my heart, and it should break yours too. Barna says, quote, "It is very possible that the historically high suicide rate is related to this statistic," end quote. This is a very sad and tragic situation, and I cannot even imagine feeling like this. The reason I started with this Sword of Damocles story is, can you imagine living, or maybe you are, but can you imagine living in this place where you just feel like this sharp sword is going to come down and kill you at any moment, and it is literally just hanging on by a thread every moment of every day? That seems like utter hell. And it seems like many people in this millennial generation are living like this. And that is a tragedy. And my hope is that you can help with that. Because this isn't about me, and it isn't about it isn't about like solving all the world's problems. It's about bringing the hope of Jesus. It's about bringing the love of Jesus to people that are hurting, because a lot of people in this world are hurting. And that's what you should hear from this, and that's what you should read from this. And then you get to the question, well, then what is the solution? And fortunately, the solution is simple, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to implement. And it is that you have to find hope outside yourself. If you are the source of your insecurities and trying to be the source of salvation, you're just doomed to fail. You cannot positive mental attitude your way through the crushing weight of this terribly unjust world. You just can't. You have to find a new way of seeing the world. Not just looking at the world, but seeing the world. You need to know what the world really is, what the world really is like, not just what you think it is or what you view it as. You need to see the world, not just as you see it, but really as God sees it. And that's part of what happens actually when you start reading the Word of God and understanding that there is more to this life and understanding more of what the kingdom of God is, because you were made for more than this world, than this culture promises you. And the weird twist is you will not be satisfied with less. You can search for meaning in all types of things. I refer you back to Jim Carrey's quote or Ecclesiastes. But until you find a relationship with your Creator, until you begin to understand your actual place in this world, you just won't find joy or peace. I'll give you two more examples. One is from Viktor Frankel, author of Man's Search for Meaning, and survivor of, I believe, two Nazi concentration camps. So this man literally saw the worst in humanity and almost the worst in human history. And yet, what he took out of that was, how do you find meaning through the worst suffering humanity could see? He says, quote, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but this one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." End quote. That was Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And he is 100% right, but I think, as he even mentions, those are few that can find that in themselves. Instead, where anyone can find this is in God. That's why the fruit of the Spirit, like joy and peace and patience and love, come from God, from the Spirit, as a gift of the Spirit, Galatians 5, around 18, 22, I'm following. We can only manufacture so much of this, and really it's just short supply. We need to get this from God. And Philippians 4 is actually another really good place where we can pull this. In Philippians 4, Paul says, "Don't be anxious about anything. In everything, by prayer, petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." This may feel like a trope, like just read God's word or believe in God or pray and all your dreams will come true. But that's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying when you actually understand the world of God, you understand God's kingdom, you realize that you're not the center of it, you realize that's a good thing, and you realize that no matter what the circumstances were. I mean, he was writing this particular letter from prison, and that probably wasn't a great situation, and yet he was still able to say he has peace, he has joy. Why? Because his circumstances didn't dictate who he was. And that's the important thing that so many miss. If you let your circumstances or your life or your social media account or any of these things, your money, your finances, dictate your happiness and who you are, you will never be happy. You have to figure out that it comes from somewhere else. And once you understand that, then you can understand that, oh, God's got me regardless of circumstance. And life may be terrible. In a very small way, I can attest that life is sometimes terrible. And yet, the only hope I have is in God and what he provides. And he does provide. That is the weird, mysterious, beyond understanding thing that I can't fully explain, other than I know that my Savior Jesus lives. I want to end with some good news. And this is in light of what's going on. And I don't have demographics for this. They probably do. But one of the things that I heard just in the last week or so is that in talking about Bibles and Bible apps, the Bible app, like if you open up your phone and you search Bible in the App Store, which was made by YouVersion, which was made by a church in America called Life Church, just exceeded 500 million downloads. And I think that should be encouraging to us, that while the lack of hope is just an actual pandemic across America and probably the world, there are people who are searching, which means when Jesus says the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few, that you do still have something that you can do. You can still bring hope to people, even just as simply as saying, hey, have you checked out the Gospel of John? Hey, have you downloaded the Bible app? There are reading plans on there that you can read every single day. I hope that you can do that both for yourself, and I hope that as many people are searching across the globe and finding God, one, that you are one of them, and that two, you can help someone else in their search as well. God bless, and as always, keep the faith.